So what have you learned about people's behavior and their reaction to being arrested for DUI? What insights do you have into this whole process after seeing it so much?
Well, I think that, the way that I started off our discussion today is something that really can inform the first part of that question, and that is, I see DUIs from people who are from all walks of life. People who make a lot of money and have high-paying jobs to, people, who you would kind of quote unquote consider the more typical criminal element. I mean, really, a DUI can affect anybody, and so, that's probably the first thing that I'd say that I notice. Especially people who have never been involved with the criminal justice system and wouldn't necessarily consider themselves criminal. You go out to dinner with a couple of friends, you have a glass of wine or a couple glasses of wine with dinner, you get in your car and leave, and before you know it, you're getting charged with a DUI. So for a lot of people, it's their first experience with the criminal justice system. They've never had anything maybe more than a real minor traffic ticket, so it's the first time they've been arrested. It's the first time that they may or may not have had to deal with jail, or being put into a holding cell, or possibly having to deal with bond, having their car possibly towed, having to pay for all those expenses, having to talk to an attorney. Maybe the first time they've had to do any of those things. And so oftentimes what I see is that people are unsure of the process, not necessarily confident that they're going to be able to resolve the situation on their own, and they want advice. And that's exactly what a lawyer is there to do, to provide that experience, to provide that advice, to kind of guide them through the process and to let them know what's going on with their case. And so, that's basically what you see, at least in my experience, quite a bit of. And then also, for people who have, a very high BAC or on a multiple offense, they're looking at jail time. And, maybe on their first DUI, they didn't have an attorney, they went in, they resolved it, they kind of got slapped on the hand, but now they're in a situation in which they're facing possibly up to a year in jail. And they have a family, or they're a single mother or father, or they're the main breadwinner for their family, or whatever the situation may be. And obviously that, losing your freedom is very serious. Maybe someone has to drive for work, and the whole DUI context is going to cause them to lose their license or have some type of restricted license. And that's going to cause them to get fired. So you see all kinds of circumstances and all kinds of things that people are facing. And really, as the attorney, you're there to help them through not just the legal system, but a lot of times with, how this is going to have an impact on their personal and professional life as well.
Okay. Is there a common set of stories that you hear from people when they come to you? Do you always hear this kind of thing or that kind of thing? If there is, can you mention like the two most common things you hear, set of circumstances?
What do you mean by set of circumstances? Set of circumstances in terms of how people got into the situation where they have the DUI, or the situation in terms of how they interacted with the police through the DUI process? What do you mean?
Yeah, I guess either. What do you tend to just hear all the time? Do you tend to hear, but I only had a drink, but this, but that? Like, are there any common stories, when people come to you that you just are hearing over and over and over again?
Well, I mean, I guess you can kind of break it down to the most common thread possible, and I guess the most common thread possible is that people were out usually having a good time with friends or family members, and were out drinking in some situation, usually some social situation, and they decided to drive, and they got in trouble for that. That's probably the most common thing, and that may not be the exact answer that you were looking for, or maybe a little bit too common, but that's usually what it is. People are out at some type of social function, a party, a get-together. They're out with friends. They're out to dinner, and they're out driving. I've had a couple cases with where I've dealt with people who have serious addictions to alcohol, and they're obviously those are unique to themselves. But the vast majority of situations are just situations, like I said, where the average Joe citizen is out in a social setting, drinks a little too much, and then has that ability to make the decision of to drive or to take a cab home or to have a designated driver, and then they make the bad choice when they're drinking, because they're drinking usually, to drive home. And that's probably the most common set of circumstances that you hear. I mean, as an attorney, I tell people, and tell me, the truth, tell me what did you actually have. So I don't necessarily get that. Well, I only had one drink. Maybe that's what they tell the police officer, but
Okay.
it's important for people to tell me the truth, so that way I can properly defend them. So,
Right.
usually, or what'll happen is people will say, I really only had 2 or 3 beers, and then you say, okay, well, what kind of beer were you having? What size was it? Draft beer? Was it a bottle beer? Oh, well, it was draft beer. Well, you know how it is at restaurants now. They say, do you want the short or do you want the tall? Well, the short beer is a 16-ounce beer, which is already more than one drink. So if you have 2 pints, or what they often call at restaurants or bars, shorties, you're already, even though you may have had 2 glasses of draft beer, it's technically more than 2 drinks. You're already at 32 ounces, not 24.
Uh,
Or maybe people say they had 2 drinks, but they were drinking the tall ones, the 25-ounce drinks. You see that a lot here in Colorado, restaurants serving draft beer in 25-ounce glasses. And if you have 2 of those, that's 50 ounces. That's more than 4 drinks. So, people will say, well, I only had 2 beers, officer. Well, how much were you really drinking? And also, if there was 2 mixed drinks, oftentimes bars and whatnot will do what they call a free pour. So they're not actually pouring 1.5 ounces of 80 proof alcohol in there. They're mixing different alcohols, or they're free pouring, and there's a lot more. So you may have had 2 mixed drinks, but the actual number of drinks you've had is a lot more. So usually either people will be honest with me and tell me that what they've actually had to drink, or people just won't realize what they've had to drink because they thought they had 2 or 3, and really what they had is 4 to 6. So that's also something that I guess I see kind of, that's pretty common here. People, think they're drinking less than they really are.
okay.
The other common thing that I see is the police report tends to look pretty common. I think that the police who've been doing this long enough know what they need to get to kind of make the situation go forward, and to have any prosecution be an effective prosecution. So it's really common. This person had bloodshot and watery eyes. They had an odor of an alcoholic beverage, and they didn't perform the voluntary roadside maneuvers to satisfaction of the police officer. So, in that sense, a lot of times when you get the reports from the police officer, they tend to look very similar.
Okay, that's really interesting because no one ever talks about the size of drinks at the bars and all that. So I'm glad you talked about that.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to understand because, like I said, a lot of times people are out and they're trying to be conscious. I think people are pretty conscious about the whole DUI thing, and they're not trying to drive drunk on purpose. So they're thinking that they've had X number of drinks over X period of time, and they've calculated incorrectly.
Okay. So do you feel that the current DUI punishments are too harsh, or are they too lax, and why?
Well, I think that one interesting thing that I'll say about that is that there's quite a bit of discretion on the part of the individual judge who is going to impose sentence. So I don't know that I could make a general statement about DUI sentencing being too harsh or too lenient because it comes down a lot, at least in Colorado, to what the individual judge thinks. And what I would say that there are some judges in some jurisdictions who they're pretty well known who are considered to be very harsh. There's other judges who seem to be more fair. I would say overall, for people who actually make an honest mistake and for a first offense, usually if you can sit down, go over the situation, and come up with a pretty good defense, whether it's legal or otherwise, I would say that most people are pretty fair in terms of the prosecution and the judge are fair. Now, you start to get to people who have multiple offenses, it depends, Sometimes, the judge just wants to throw the person in jail, and the person really has an addiction problem, a true addiction problem, and jail isn't necessarily the right answer. So, oftentimes with people who've had multiple offenses or who have actual addiction problems, I would say probably the sentences tend to be a little too harsh, in my opinion, because they focus more on incarceration rather than on rehabilitation. And maybe that's just a shortcoming of the legal system. They're not really adequately prepared or have the know-how or the ability or the funding or whatever it may be to provide the necessary rehabilitation for people.